Hello, everyone. I'm Father Alex Andahar,
And I'm the Reverend David Marshall.
and this is A Bridge Between, where we bridge our knowledge of the sacred scriptures. We bridge the physical distance between ourselves. And today, it looks like this is our Sabbath edition, even though we're not recording on the Sabbath. We are talking about the Sabbath.
We're recording on the third day, though, Tuesday, so that's a good thing. I'm on Longboat Key, and the church I serve is All Angels, and Alex is in Sun City Center.
Yep, St. John the Divine.
Yeah. So just for folks to know the different locations, because they might say, "Why? Where is there a bridge?" Well, it's Florida. There's lots of bridges
Yep.
because there's a whole bunch of water. So you were bringing up the Sabbath.
Right. So this Sunday, this coming Sunday, June 2nd, there's this focus in the lectionary on the Sabbath. And I
Mhm.
think it's very interesting because the concept and the understanding that is scriptural of the Sabbath, I think, is different than at least my initial understanding of it is today. And
Okay.
what I mean by that is because I'm living in a different context, a different time period. So when we look at Deuteronomy and, keep holy the Sabbath day, and then we look at the Mark reading for the gospel for Sunday, and we see Jesus kind of getting at odds with the Pharisees because he's plucking grain or he's doing this, healing on the Sabbath. I think those are different contexts than what you and I are experiencing. The lesson is still valid, but I think the context has to be applied a little bit differently, if that makes sense.
It does. Can I bring up a little bit of historical background to it?
Sure.
In Jesus's day, and a couple hundred years before and a couple hundred years after, there was a massive argument going on with people of the Jewish faith about a number of things, but the Sabbath being one of the center things that they were arguing about. They were trying to figure out what it means and what is the law of Moses. What does it mean in our day and our time? Um, and in the Greco-Roman world, they viewed work differently, and they had a different schedule. And so, taking a Saturday off, that was, a big time for them to be working. And, is it really a Saturday? Can we move it? There were all sorts of discussions going on. And I think that conversation is still alive and well in our own day and our own time.
Oh, absolutely. And that's part
So,
of what I want to talk about today. So let's kind of take one step backwards here and look at the Deuteronomy text. When it says keep the Sabbath day holy, what do they mean by that? Or what does God
um,
mean by that?
yeah. Oh, great. I'm not going to speak for God.
Well,
So,
what do we interpret it as
thank
meaning?
you. Good. Because either the computer explodes or my head or both. Anyway, that's what they were trying to figure out. What in the world does this mean? That they had been given a rich tradition that not even their animals. And so, to be very specific, the seventh day, which is Saturday, Monday's the first day, Sunday's the first day of the week,
Hmm.
and then Saturday is the Sabbath. And those that say Sunday's the Sabbath are wrong. They are flat out incorrect. Is it a Christian Sabbath? Well, we can discuss that, but um, and that's part of the confusion is that different calendars, different days, and in this type of polytheistic type world,
Hmm.
made it really interesting. So, what this is defining is 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord. You
Right.
shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, which means you can't have you rest and everybody else work around you. Not your male or female servant, not your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or any of the resident aliens in your town, any of the immigrants, any of the non Jewish people in your towns,
Hmm.
so that your male and female servants they may rest as well as you. Remember, you were once a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
So here's where the question I think comes up. If everybody gets a day off,
Mm-hmm.
certain things still need to be done. They didn't have refrigeration back
Okay.
then. So you can't just say, well, I'm going to make all my food on Friday and then, take it out of the Tupperware on Saturday and heat it up in the microwave.
But
But
when they were in the wilderness, that they would get twice the portion of the manna and the
you're right.
quails.
You're right.
They would get it, right? They would collect it, and then they would eat it on the day of rest because it is already set aside for them. When they tried to set aside the
More.
manna and collect more than what they needed to eat later, worms would come and that would make them sick. But something magical, if you will, happened with the Friday offering so that they could do. And again, that this is the argument, especially in Jesus's day. We are not in the wilderness. Like we don't have the manna. We now have to work for these things. So that law that worked for the manna, how does it work for us?
And I think here is where we face our connection with Jesus's time in saying, from a practical standpoint, there are things that need to be done.
Yeah,
There is a society that needs to run. For example, in our day, we would say there are emergency services that need to be provided, hospitals that need to be open, parts of the government, and so on and so forth.
air traffic
And
controllers.
air traffic controllers, please, yes. And so I think that what we're talking about here is the intention and the desire, as well as we can, to live into the Sabbath. And here, when Jesus talks about that, the Sabbath was made for man and not the other way around,
Hmm.
there's a trap there that I want to bring up. But it
Okay.
is important to acknowledge that God set aside and created the Sabbath because people could be prone to only work and never rest. And God even models this in the act of creation to saying,
Hmm.
6 days God labored, the seventh day God rested. Thank God God rested, because if not,
Hmm.
we'd still be working. But I think the trap, though, is if we read that to say that the Sabbath was made for us, then that means we can do whatever we want on the Sabbath. That's not what I believe Jesus is saying.
I'm going to dig even further. Jesus
Dig
is
it.
saying we can't make rules and imprison other people with these rules for what they can do because man was not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. Um,
Let me push back on that.
okay.
So here's the question then. When I was living in Tennessee, there were still certain towns where stores were closed, things were not open.
Hmm.
The blue laws, right?
Okay.
Even when I was in Tallahassee, there were certain things that were closed and stuff like that. So, can a society, can a town or something make laws to kind of promote the health of the Sabbath by telling people, hey, listen, certain things are going to be closed because everybody needs a rest.
Okay. But if you're a shoemaker and
Hmm.
you come in on a Saturday to get caught up on making shoes, and
Hmm.
then the religious leaders of your town tell everybody, do not buy shoes from this guy. He worked on the Sabbath.
Okay,
That
that's
that's
different. That's different.
well, but that's what Jesus is talking about.
Okay, see,
Um,
we got to make that distinction. We've got to
right.
make that distinction. And so we look in our society now that there has been, I think, a consistent evolution in our treatment of the Sabbath to become just another day. And this has happened a couple of ways. I think
Okay.
one of the first ways is that the Sabbath, for myself, Saturday, right? But for others, Sunday. For some people who consider that their Sabbath time,
Hmm.
that time is not in any way holy or
Hmm.
set aside for worship
Hmm.
or anything like that. It's not a time for family to get together. It can be often mostly just a time for only areas of leisure, like I think about sports leagues and stuff like that. So I'm kind of leaning into the argument that the church is trying to face right now, where we see more and more people doing things on Sunday mornings.
Hmm.
And we're trying to push against that and say, no, Sunday is a holy day. Sunday is a sacred day. Try to reserve it as such.
Yeah, I agree. You and I both have a clergy friend who we have invited out onto my boat, and she won't go on Monday because Monday's her Sabbath.
Right.
And we try to tell her, but this is rest, and she's like, no, it's not rest.
Well,
It's
I will
um,
vouch for her and say that being around the two of us at the same time is work.
I would agree. Right? Yes. So she would go with us on a Thursday, but I respect her for a whole bunch of reasons, and this is One of them that's near the top of my list is that she holds her health, her mental health, very closely, and nobody else around her will guard it. That's only her, and so she does, and
Right.
I'm very impressed.
So now
And
let's
mhm,
let's let's take one next step here and let's talk about our unique relationship to the Sabbath, you and I,
okay,
because as clergy, there are
mhm,
times when we have to. We it is obligated for us to work on a Saturday, and of
yeah,
course, we are obligated to work on Sunday.
mhm,
That's why for many clergy people, or I think most clergy people, it's either a Monday or a Friday is their Sabbath,
mhm.
which is very hard to guard, very
Oh yeah,
hard.
yeah.
And so, talk to me a little bit about what your experience has been about recognizing those moments that you have to work on the Sabbath.
Well, first, my experience is when we do, now that we're outside of the Easter season and we're back to the general confession, the top of my list of things that I confess is that I have not kept your Sabbath holy, right? That
Mhm.
I haven't, that I tend to take that opportunity to work. The one thing that I'm trying that's working is that I sunset, sundown time on Friday is the last time I check email, and then I don't check it until the sun sets on Saturday night. Now, some of you have received emails from me on Saturday. These are very few and far between, and it's generally because I am working for a very specific reason. So we do funerals, we do weddings, things just show up. We have occasionally diocesan conference. You know, we have other things that just show up on a Saturday. And I think God is understanding and compassionate to know that if we are working on that Saturday, that we then find another day, like our friend does, and she calls Monday her Sabbath, that we find a time to set aside for that, because we are the soldiers, we are the workers, we are the front line, we're the essential workers, if you will, of this type of gospel work. And when others have that day off, um, that's when we engage.
I agree, and I think there's two things I agree with there, and one you didn't state explicitly, but I want to tease it out a little bit. But the first one is that sometimes our work is necessary to care for others. So
Mhm.
doing the funeral or a wedding on a Saturday. Also, we participate in the councils of the church, so a diocesan convention, things of that nature. But I think the other part of it is that we model and try to model what the Sabbath should look like for others because they also need to rest. When we
Mhm.
come to church and we work here, there's support staff, there's volunteers, there's other people who also come and work alongside of us. It's being thoughtful and considerate of them.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example about not just Sabbath, but rest and leisure, is that I almost never do a Thanksgiving Day service.
Right.
There's another clergy person that I worked with that he loved to do it, and there was a group of people that really enjoyed it and felt fed by it. But I said
Right.
to myself, this is a day for me and my family,
Mhm.
and not just that, but also this is a day that I personally will not be calling people in to serve with me because I'm acknowledging that they also need that rest as well.
Yeah.
But kind of coming back to keeping the day holy. Remember, I think we talked a little bit about holy meaning being set aside for God. And so, am I intentionally trying to encounter God in prayer, resting in God, so to speak, in prayer on the Sabbath? That doesn't mean that I'm trying to work at prayer. I'm using quotation marks for those
Mhm.
of you who are
Mhm.
listening online.
Right.
But to say that part of my rest can be resting in God. What do you think of that?
I think that's wonderful. I have a couple more things to add to your list. Many years ago, my wife and I made the decision that Christmas Day is for the Marshall family,
Mm-hmm.
and that the church can have a Christmas Day service. Fine. I'm just not going to be there.
Okay.
And when we were discerning a call here, I was looking at their schedule and I said, I see that there's no Christmas Day service. Like, oh, no, no, we would never have it. We have it on Christmas Eve. We don't have a service on Christmas Day. That's when you're with your family. Right. Um, so that's Another way, so Thanksgiving is that way. We have a interfaith service for Thanksgiving that shows up on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving.
Hmm.
And I'm suggesting to my cleric friends that we move it to the Tuesday before Thursday, because a lot of our folks leave the week of Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
and it becomes a burden for us to do the Tuesday service. And so we're going to, we're still going to have it. We're still going to celebrate and be thankful. But I think that this is what Jesus is weaving in there. That the second paragraph of Mark's reading is that there was a man who had a withered hand.
Hmm.
Men with withered hands can't work.
Right.
Um, that all they can do is beg.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to see, is he going to cure this man on the Sabbath? And the interesting thing to me in Mark in chapter 2 is that they didn't watch him to see if he could. They believed he could. They
Right.
knew
That
he
wasn't a
could.
question. Yeah.
He, right. He had already done this before, not captured in Mark's gospel, which is great.
Yeah.
They watched to see whether he would on the Sabbath. Um, and then he looked around, and this is where we get an emotion from Mark. Jesus looked around and said, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" They were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So Jesus was both grieved and angry.
This
So
reminds me. Go ahead.
mhm.
This reminds me of a story, but I want to let you finish. Sorry.
No, it
Go
reminds you of what?
Okay, so this reminds me of a story that's a priest told me, um, of caring for people who work in the service industry, especially
Mhm.
those who work in restaurants and things like that, where they are most often um, engaged in their work during the weekend. I mean, that is when
Yeah.
people come out for leisure and to eat at restaurants, right?
Hmm.
And in this case, it was people whose English, whose language was other than English. And so what he found is that the only way he could do church for them was on like a Thursday night. That was like for some reason like their least busy night, and he would go
Yeah.
in after the time had been of cleaning and setting up for the next day had been completed, and several of the workers there had expressed, "Please come and do church for us." And at first, I have to admit, I was like the Pharisee, and I bristled initially because I
Right.
said, "You can't do church on Thursday." And then,
Hmm.
of course, it hit me to say that for these people, this is the only time that they have.
Hmm.
And so if you're preaching this Sunday about this particular text, one of the things to maybe challenge and welcome people through is this idea of, if you're a person who is still working, you're not retired, and you work a lot, when is your Sabbath? Do you have any Sabbath time? That's number one. And
Hmm.
then in that Sabbath time, is there any time that you're spending with God? Is there any time that your heart, your mind, and your body are resting in God? Because we know in our society what burnout looks like,
Hmm.
right? And for some of us, it's just look in the mirror. So, number one, do you have any time that you declare that you kind of like put a barrier and boundary around? That's number one. And then number two, do you set aside any of that time for God? And I think for many people who work very hard, it's incredibly difficult to do this. I
Hmm.
find it difficult. I'm just going to confess that I find it difficult to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that we have to identify with is that our lives are liminal, that they aren't what they were, they aren't what they're becoming. We're always in this middle time. And
Hmm.
I'm reminded that there will be a Christmas morning of when we won't have our boys in the house, right? That
Yeah,
Christmas morning will be something different. And maybe then I can serve on a Christmas Day service somewhere else to give a different priest time off for her to be with her family, right?
correct.
That's that type of liminal time. And that I look forward to the day one day when Christy and I move into a condo and I don't have a whole list of chores that have to get done because somebody else does it. And but to embrace and to enjoy the tasks that we have now. That to care for our spouses, to care for our children, to care for ourselves, to maintain our homes. That those are all things that are blessings,
Yeah.
and um, and to remember that we serve God, we serve one another through our families, um, and we need to take care of ourselves. We have to juggle all of those things together.
Well, I think that I agree completely. And I think the last thing that I would say, to kind of bring us back to the center of this, is acknowledging, as fellow Christians and also as clergy who are meant to pastor to people, is to meet people where they are in their understanding of time, in their expression of work, because it's easy for me to say to somebody else, well, you're not working hard enough for the kingdom, or you're not giving enough time to the church. We need to listen first to what
Mm-hmm.
people are experiencing, because for, let's say you're a person who's has a young family still, and it takes up the majority of your time, giving any time to the church is huge. I mean,
Yeah,
even that, even just a few moments, it's like the widow's mite. It's giving everything that you have just to show up to church.
yeah,
We have to respect that.
we do.
But
Right.
we also need to challenge and say, if you're exhausted, are there times and places within your life that maybe you can take some time away from? And I'll give you an example. When we had our first boy, Samuel, and I realized the amount of time that I was spending doing other things besides spending time with my family. And one of
Mm-hmm.
them was I loved watching football, even more so than I do now. And I realized, like, there's a Monday night game, there's a Thursday night game, something on Friday, Saturday, and so that's 5 days. You know, that could be way too much time dedicated to something.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to realize maybe it's not as important as I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some times when I'm with my family and I say, maybe my work isn't as important as I think it is. Maybe this is more important,
Yeah.
right now. So Friday, you and I went out on the boat, had a great time. I broke the engine again. Uh, we had
Well,
to change a
broke
fuse.
is a
Well,
it's a
I
that might be a misleading term.
well
It's still running.
I
It's
I
running great.
I temporarily inhibited the engine. Um,
Thank you. Well,
Thank
and you
you.
taught me something about my motor too. That was
You know,
nice. So,
but we still had a lot of fun. And there were times, I would kind of look at my watch and be conscious of the time, and I would say, no, don't do that. We're here. We've set aside this time for leisure and fellowship for the four of us. You brought Elijah, I brought Sam, and it was
mhm.
just a lot of fun, and it felt
It was awesome.
restorative to be that. So maybe that's the other thing, that church is also a place of restoration, that we come not just to work, but we also are called to feel in the presence of one another, that there's fellowship and rest. So these are all
Yep.
things that people can be talking about as they get ready, to preach this Sunday. And also, if you're the preacher, be thinking, please, about yourself,
Hmm.
and where are you in relationship to the Sabbath?
Well, I have a couple things for preachers, but if I can go back to
Mhm.
Friday and being on the boat, I often ask Elijah or Ethan, "Wait, what was your favorite thing that we did?" Um, and so, if you ask me, what was one of the favorite things that I saw? You and Samuel wrestling. That is at the very top of you guys. So we were in waist high water, thigh high water,
Maybe.
and the tide was so strong. I've never felt it that strong before. Like it was like we're standing in a river and we're on a sandbar. And you guys started slow motion wrestling, and it makes me. And so you're both were bare chested, of course, because we're out in the water. And it's one of those like when he was a young baby, you would hold him against your chest, but
Mhm.
then something happens and we stop doing that. Well, the boat brought that back, and it was just you and Samuel. It wasn't your wife. It wasn't Gregory. Just you two, right? And that harkened back to the day before Gregory was born. You know that
Mhm.
that's just cool. And not to get all teary eyed, I don't know how many more times like that we get. Because he's
Yeah.
thinking college, and and then off he goes. And so that's why without pounding on my table. That's why these things are so gosh darn important, right? To be able to have those experiences and to go out and do that. Because there are the amount of times that you have to change his diaper are small, and that he grows out of those. And so to reorganize your schedule, the things that are more important. The other thing that I think that preachers may want to consider is the Greco-Roman, specifically the Roman structure that Palestine was living under in Jesus's day. They were continually eating away at people's time. And in particular, the tax structure made it so that they had to farm and they had to fish more than they had ever fished before because of how expensive things were. If this sounds familiar, um, that in that struggle, Jesus is telling them that the Sabbath is something that is restorative and to hold on to that, and that we are watching the NFL. Like on the West Coast, you haven't experienced this. That most of the games that are played start at 1 o'clock East Coast, which is
Hmm.
10 a.m. Sunday morning, which is the primary time for people to go to church on
Yeah.
Sunday. So we have an 8 o'clock service, but then they started throwing in having a game in England, which starts at 6:30
Yeah.
usually in Seattle, and just completely wipes out any sort of sense of having a service. And so we're having our annual meeting on the same day as the Super Bowl, and we're going to embrace it. Our annual meeting starts at 11:30. Super Bowl this time starts at 6:30. So that gives plenty of time for people to go and get ready. But we are constantly in this struggle, and pastors as well used to be able to take a Sabbath by walking away from the church and walking to the parsonage or wherever they lived, and nobody could get a hold of them. But now we
Nope.
have all sorts of communication, telecommunication means,
Yeah.
and so we have to then really consider what our Sabbath is and to really take our time to rest and to relax, and also to focus on God.
So I want to end with one line that I think I would love to use in preaching about the Sabbath, which is what Jesus, kind of like echoing what Jesus said, really, is that the Sabbath was made for you and I.
Mhm.
God made it intentionally because he
Yeah.
loves us, to care for us, to show a desire for us to be restored.
Yep.
And Jesus himself understood the power of that,
Mhm.
so much so that he was willing to get into an argument about it. And when Jesus
Well,
argues about something, it's important to
right.
him.
The last sentence, the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired against him how to destroy him.
Wow, you think people argue with you about vacation time? Sheesh.
Right. Um, wow.
Yeah,
Um, so this is obviously a hot button in their day,
yeah,
and maybe in ours too.
yeah.
Um,
So I'm
but
thankful. Go ahead.
one thing that gives me rest, one thing that drives me closer to God is chatting with you about such matters. So, um,
And one thing that brings me closer to God is not only chatting with you about it, but also taking some Sabbath time with you and having fellowship. So we need to be doing that again real soon.
yes, and maybe Gregory will come this time.
Yes, I think I can get him out there.
That would be
But
awesome.
it's been a pleasure, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to those of you who are watching and listening. And we pay attention, even if we don't always get a chance to respond. We are paying attention. We're thankful, and we'll catch you in the next one.
God bless.